He was beginning to give up hope of ever reaching the top, when suddenly, without any warning, the brush freed itself, and he nearly fell over into the grate as he clung to the last of the rods. Paddington sat in the fireplace for a while, mopping his brow with a corner of the sheet, and then, after disappearing upstairs for a few moments, he hurried outside carrying his binoculars. According to a note on the box lid, the exciting part about sweeping a chimney was always the moment when the brush popped out of the chimney pot, and he was particularly anxious to see it for himself. Carefully adjusting the glasses, he climbed the ladder which Mr Briggs the builder had left standing against the side of the house, and peered up at the roof with a pleased expression on his face. The view through the binoculars of the brush poking out of Mr Brown's chimney pot almost exactly matched the picture on the box. Paddington spent some time drinking in the view, and then he climbed back down the ladder and hurried into the house, wearing the air of a bear with a job well done. All in all, it had been a good morning's work, and he felt sure the Browns would be very pleased when they reached home and found how busy he'd been. Pulling the brush back down the chimney proved to be a lot easier than pushing it up had been, and it seemed only a matter of moments before he found himself reaching up behind the sheet for the last of the rods. It was as he disentangled himself from the sheet that a startled expression suddenly came over Paddington's face, and he nearly fell over backwards with surprise as he stared at the rod in his paw. He rubbed his eyes in case he'd got some soot in them by mistake, and then gazed at the end of the rod again. It was definitely the last one of the set, as he'd counted them all most carefully, but of the brush itself there was nothing to be seen. After peering hopefully up the chimney several times, Paddington sat down anxiously in the fireplace in order to consult the instructions on the box. As he lifted the lid, he suddenly caught sight of a large red label pasted to the bottom of the box. It had escaped his notice before, and as he read it, his eyes grew larger and larger. It said simply, "Warning. After sweeping the chimney, great care must be taken when unscrewing rods, otherwise the brush may become detached." "My brush become detached!" exclaimed Paddington bitterly, addressing the world in general as he gazed at the rod in one paw and the box in the other. Apart from leaving the warning about the brush becoming detached until it was far too late, the only advice the notice seemed to give for when things did go wrong was contained in the 4 words, "Consult your nearest dealer." Paddington sat in the fireplace with a mournful expression on his face. He felt sure the Barkridges wouldn't be at all keen if he consulted them on the subject of Mr Brown's brush being stuck up his chimney, and he was equally certain that Mr Brown himself would be even less happy when he heard the news. In fact, after giving the matter a great deal of thought, the only way he could see to soften the blow at all was to clear up some of the mess, and hope that while he did so, he might get an idea on the subject. If, earlier in the day, the Browns' dining room had given the impression of having been in the path of a hurricane, it now looked as if a belt of thick smog had passed through as well. Despite the dust sheet, everything seemed to be covered in a thin layer of soot, and looking around the room, Paddington decided that in more ways than one he'd never seen things looking quite so black. Mr Brown took his head out of the chimney and looked round at the others. "I can't understand it," he exclaimed. "That's the 3rd time I've tried to light the fire. It keeps going out." Mrs Brown picked up a newspaper and began waving some of the smoke away. "There's obviously been another fall of soot," she said. "It's everywhere. If you ask me, the chimney is blocked. I told you it needed sweeping." "How could I sweep it?" said Mr Brown crossly. "The outfit only arrived this morning." The Browns grouped themselves unhappily round the fireplace and stared at the pile of used matches. "And that's another thing," continued Mr Brown. "I'm sending it straight back to Barkridge's. It's filthy dirty, and there isn't even a brush. You can't sweep a chimney without a brush." "Perhaps Paddington's borrowed it for something," said Mrs Brown vaguely. "I can't find him anywhere." "Paddington?" echoed Mr Brown. "What would he want with a brush?" "There's no knowing," said Mrs Bird ominously. Mrs Bird didn't like the signs of a hurried cleaning up she'd noticed in the dining room, or the various sooty paw marks which she'd discovered during a quick glance round the rest of the house, but in view of the look on Mr Brown's face, she wisely kept her thoughts to herself. "He hasn't touched his treacle pudding," said Mrs Brown, "and that's most unusual." "Blow Paddington's treacle pudding," replied Mr Brown. "I'm more worried about the fire." Mrs Brown opened the French windows and looked into the garden. "Perhaps Mr Briggs can help," she said. "He's just come back." In answer to Mrs Brown's call, Mr Briggs, the builder, came into the dining room and put his ear to the chimney with an experienced air. "Jackdaws," he said after a moment. "You got Jackdaw's nest in your pot. If you listen, you can hear him coughing." "Coughing?" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "We didn't know jackdaws coughed." "You'd cough, ma'am," said Mr. Briggs, "if someone tried to light a fire under your nest. But don't worry," he continued, opening up Mr. Brown's cleaning set. "I'll have it out in a jiffy." The Browns stood back and watched while Mr. Briggs began pushing the rods up the chimney. "Good job you had these," he went on. "Otherwise it might have been a rare old job." Mr. Briggs' face became redder and redder as the rods got harder to push, but at long last he gave a final upward heave, and there was a loud crashing noise as something heavy landed in the grate. "There you are," he announced triumphantly. "What did I tell you?" Mr. Brown adjusted his glasses and peered at the round, black, bristly object lying on the hearth. "It looks a funny sort of bird's nest to me," he said. "In fact, if you ask me, it's more like the brush out of a chimney-sweeping outfit." "You're quite right," said Mr. Briggs, scratching his head. "It's a brush, all right." Mr. Briggs began to look even more puzzled as he picked up the object and examined it more closely. "It seems to be in some sort of container," he exclaimed. "That's not a container," said Mrs. Brown. "It's Paddington's hat." "Good heavens! So it is," exclaimed Mr. Brown. "What's it doing up the chimney, and with my brush inside of it?" "Mercy me," interrupted Mrs. Bird, pointing towards the window. "Look!" The others turned and followed the direction of her gaze. "I can't see anything," said Mr. Brown. Is anything the matter?" asked Mrs. Brown, looking at her housekeeper with some concern. "You've gone quite white." "I thought I saw a chimney pot go past the window," exclaimed Mrs. Bird, reaching for her smelling salts. Mr. and Mrs. Brown exchanged glances. Normally Mrs. Bird was the sanest member of the family, and it was most unusual for her to have hallucinations. "I think you'd better sit down," said Mr. Brown, drawing up a chair. "Perhaps the excitement's been too much for you." "It's all right, Mrs. Bird," came a familiar, if somewhat muffled voice from the dining-room doorway. "It's only me." If Mrs. Bird had been taken by surprise a moment before, the others looked even more amazed as they turned and stared at the black object before them. In place of his usual headgear, Paddington was wearing what appeared to be half a chimney pot, which covered his ears and came down over his eyes like an oversized top hat. "I'm afraid it broke off when Mr. Briggs poked his rods up the chimney," he explained, when the noise had died down. "But what on earth were you doing up on the roof in the first place?" asked Mr. Brown. "I was dusting the chimney," said Paddington sadly. "The brush got detached by mistake, and I was trying to rescue it." "Paddington?" echoed Mr. Briggs disbelievingly as he began levering the pot off. "Did you say Paddington? Looks more like Clapham Junction to me, proper mess he's in." Paddington looked most offended at Mr. Briggs' words as he sat on the floor rubbing his ears. It had been bad enough losing Mr. Brown's brush up the chimney in the first place, but then to get his head stuck inside the pot and be mistaken for a bird's nest into the bargain seemed the unkindest of all. "I know one thing," said Mrs. Bird sternly. "You're going straight up to the bathroom. We must have the dirtiest pair within 50 miles. Mr. Briggs gave a sudden chuckle as he looked at the others. "I'll say this much," he remarked, pouring oil on the troubled waters. "You may not have the cleanest pair within 50 miles, but I'm willing to bet there isn't a cleaner chimney." Paddington looked at Mr. Briggs gratefully, and then hurried out of the room before any more questions could be asked. For once in his life he agreed with Mrs. Bird that a nice hot bath with plenty of soap was the best order of the day. Apart from that, he had just remembered that he hadn't yet eaten his sausage salad, let alone his treacle pudding. Paddington was very keen on treacle pudding, and he was anxious to make sure the cooker was turned on so that it would all be ready for him when he got downstairs again.